Deborah Lee Atrops was 30 years old. In 1988, she was a young mother living in Oregon, trying to hold her life together while everything around her shifted. Her daughter, Rhianna, was only 8 months old. The baby was too young to remember anything about her mother. She would grow up with a single truth that never changed. Her mom was gone, and no one could tell her exactly why. Deborah had been married to Robert Elmer Atrops, known as Bob Atrops. The marriage moved fast. They married in June 1987, and within months, they adopted Rhianna. From the outside, it looked like a new family starting fresh, but the foundation was already cracking. They argued. The relationship grew tense and unstable. Not long after Rhianna came home, Deborah moved out. She rented an apartment in Salem, about 30 miles away from Bob. They were separated, living apart, and navigating custody and handoffs with a baby caught between them. Deborah was trying to start over, but she was also still tangled in the same web of people, pressure, and choices that had shaped her life for years. By the second half of 1988, her relationships were complicated. She had reconnected with an old boyfriend, Jeff Freeberg. The connection never fully settled into something stable, but it stayed present in her life. Jeff loaned Deborah $8,000, money connected to her car. To some, it looked like help. To some, it looked like help. To others, it looked like another thread that could tighten into motive if things went wrong. By September 1988, Deborah was dating someone new, a man from her workplace named John Pearson. John was separated from his wife and had 2 young boys. Deborah was excited about him, but she was careful. She was worried about Bob finding out. That fear was not vague. It was specific, the kind of fear that shapes daily decisions, the kind that makes a person hide happiness so it does not trigger violence. In the weeks before her death, Deborah believed Bob was suspicious she was seeing someone. She believed that if he confirmed it, she would not be safe. Then Tuesday, November 29th, 1988 arrived. That day would become the final day Deborah was seen alive. Her schedule included a hair appointment in Tigard, Oregon, at a salon called Raz Ma Tas. After the appointment, she was expected to pick up Rhianna from Bob's home. She never arrived. At 9:40 p.m., Bob called Tigard police. He said Deborah had not shown up after her appointment. He told the dispatcher she had been expected and that she was missing. He claimed he had driven the route and saw no sign of her. The calls did not stop there. At 10:25 p.m., he called again. At 11:29 p.m., he called a third time. At 11:34 p.m., after being directed elsewhere, he called Washington County authorities, and the missing persons process began. Began. The rhythm of those calls stood out. They came quickly, one after another, as if he needed his concern recorded, repeated, and planted into the timeline before anyone else could shape it. But there was one call he never made. He did not call Deborah. He did not call her Salem apartment that night, Emmy. He never called it at all. In the most basic moment of a disappearance, the first instinct is to reach the person who is missing. Deborah had her own place. She had her own phone. Even if they were separated, she was still the person at the center of the emergency. But Bob never dialed her number. The next morning, the missing persons case continued. Deborah would not be missing for long. On Thursday, December 1, 1988, her car was found in Beaverton, Oregon, near a construction site. The details of the scene felt staged, as if someone wanted the vehicle discovered but wanted it to reveal as little as possible. The license plates had been removed. A window was open. The keys were inside. Then the trunk was opened. Deborah was inside, face down. She was still dressed nicely. Her coat was still on. She had been placed into the trunk with a strange kind of care, as if the killer took time to position her, not simply throw her away. She had been strangled. There were no signs of sexual assault. Mud marked the case from the beginning. There was mud on Deborah's coat and shoes. There was mud on the steering wheel. There was mud on the front passenger tire. And on the hood, there were broad swipes that suggested wiping, like someone had used clothing to smear away fingerprints and erase contact. The vehicle was processed, searched, and examined, but the case did not give up a clean answer. Attention turned to Bob's home, located on a rural road in Sherwood, Oregon on Southwest Kinzelman Road. Bob lived about 5 miles from where Deborah's car was found. The driveway was a mix of mud, dirt, and gravel, exactly the kind of surface that could hold a short-lived memory of tires passing through. Bob said Deborah had last been there about a week before her murder, but the ground around his home raised doubts. Photos were taken of tire tracks. Soil was collected from the driveway and lawn. The goal was simple. If Deborah's car had been there the night she vanished, the earth might still tell the truth. No tire tracks were ever confirmed as a match to Deborah's car. In the hours after the car was found and the trunk was opened, Bob was informed that his estranged wife was dead. People around him noticed something that did not fit. He appeared calm in a way that felt wrong for the moment. Deborah's mother, Gloria, was consumed by grief. Deborah's stepfather, Ed Holland, held her as she sobbed. The people who loved Deborah reacted with shock and collapse, the kind that comes when a life is cut off without warning. Bob's reaction did not match that. But suspicion alone was not enough. In 1988, there was no single piece of proof that could be held up as the answer. Deborah's life was full of men, secrets, and overlapping timelines. The investigators did what they could with what they had. They questioned Jeff Rayberg. He gave an alibi. He appeared straightforward. They questioned John Pearson. He said he was with his children and his estranged wife that night. He also revealed something unsettling. He knew about Deborah's hair appointment. He also knew an unusual amount about Deborah's car. He described items inside it in detail, including a Burger King bag, a box with cranberries, and a child car seat. He also commented on the trunk, saying there was not enough room for a body and that items would have to be removed. It was a strange thing to say, especially before the public knew where Deborah had been found. Still, John continued cooperating. He sat for multiple interviews, he took a polygraph, and passed. Then there was Bob's own behavior after the murder. 1 week after Deborah's body was found, Bob hired a lawyer and declined to take a polygraph. He also claimed that on the night Deborah vanished, while waiting at home, he made calls to the babysitter, Deborah's boss, and Deborah's parents. The babysitter confirmed receiving a call. Whoa. Deborah's parents confirmed receiving a call. Ed Holland confirmed receiving a call, but those calls were long distance, and they should have appeared on Bob's phone bill. They did not. It created a hole in the story that would never close, not in 1988 and not for decades after. The obvious question became unavoidable. If those calls happened, and they did, but the bill did not show them, then Bob was not calling from where he said he was. That gap suggested he was out of the house that night. If he was out, then he was not simply waiting. He was moving. The theory formed early and hardened over time. Bob killed Deborah, then disposed of her car and body, and made those calls while he was out, creating the illusion that he was home searching and worried. In 1988, there was no proof tying those calls to a payphone and no way to check every public phone in the area. The investigation hit its limits. The case slowed, then stopped. In 1990, there was a final meeting with Bob, a last push to account for the missing calls or admit what happened. Bob maintained his innocence. After that, the case went quiet. Years passed, then decades. Rhianna grew up. She learned about her mother's murder when she was 6 or 7 years old. Her memories were not of Deborah, but of the story around Deborah. She remembered finding a picture of a woman in an album, asking who it was, and being told simply that it was her mom. Her father raised her with a steady hand. In her eyes, he was present, loving and attentive. She believed she was his number one priority. She later described him as a doting grandfather to her 3 children. To Rhianna, the idea that Bob could have strangled Deborah and put her in the trunk did not fit the man she knew. But the case was not finished. In 2022, a cold case team reopened Deborah Atrops' murder and pushed the evidence through modern testing. The coat Deborah was wearing in the trunk became central. Swabs were taken from the collar and shoulder area, the area most likely to be touched during a strangling. A DNA mixture was found there. The lab compared the mixture against known individuals. John Pearson was excluded. Jeff Freeberg was excluded. Bob Atrops could not be excluded. It was not a direct match. It was not definitive. The DNA was extremely low level, the equivalent of about 6 skin cells. It was the kind of trace that could be transferred through ordinary contact, especially when a couple shares custody of a baby and exchanges items and touches the same surfaces. But it was still a piece, and it did not point away from Bob. The soil evidence was tested too. The FBI lab concluded that the mud on Deborah's car tire did not match the mud where the car was found near the construction site. Instead, the mud on the tire was indistinguishable from the mud taken from Bob's lawn in color, composition, and texture. It suggested Deborah's car had been on Bob's property the night she vanished. That contradicted Bob's own timeline, including his claim that Deborah had not been there for about 10 days. As the cold case team re-examined Bob's behavior, they also returned to the phone calls. In 2022, Bob agreed to speak again, the first time he had discussed the case in decades. He was asked again about the missing calls from 1988. This time, he gave a new explanation. He said he had used a Nokia calling card to make the long-distance calls from home, which would explain why they did not appear as expected on the phone bill. But the story created new problems. Calling cards at the time required long strings of numbers, a 16-digit calling card number, and then another code. The idea of someone frantically searching for his wife while calmly entering long codes into a phone did not fit the emotional urgency Bob had claimed. And if he truly used a calling card in 1988, it raised another question. Why had he never said that before? In 2023, the case went to a grand jury and an indictment followed. On March 2, 2023, at 5 a.m., Rhianna received the call that her father had been arrested. She was in shock. In her mind, the justice system had arrested the wrong man. To her, the arrest was not only a legal move, it was the beginning of a second loss. She had already lost her mother as a baby. Now she faced losing her father while he was still alive. Bob pleaded not guilty. The defense focused heavily on John Pearson. John had known Deborah's schedule. He knew she would be at the hair appointment. He knew where she was going to be. He also knew details about her car that seemed too specific. The defense argued there was more pointing toward John Pearson than toward Bob. They also pointed to evidence from Deborah's autopsy. Vaginal swabs taken during the autopsy contained semen identified as John Pearson's with an enormous statistical likelihood. That biological evidence existed 2 days after Deborah's disappearance. John Pearson had also told law enforcement in 2022 that he had not had sex with Deborah in the 72 hours before she was murdered, and definitely not on the day she was murdered. The semen evidence contradicted that claim. As the trial approached, the cold case team wanted John Pearson to testify. But he stopped responding. He was located in Arizona. He was ill and had an outstanding Dewey warrant in Oregon. 5 days before opening arguments with authorities outside his trailer, John Pearson killed himself. His death landed like a heavy object in the middle of the case. It was a sudden end to a voice that might have clarified critical details or deepened the confusion. When the trial began in spring 2025 at the Washington County Courthouse, the story of Deborah Atrops became a battle of pieces. No one could recreate every minute of the night Deborah vanished. There were gaps that could never be filled. The case would depend on whether the collected fragments formed one clear picture. The prosecution emphasized Bob's behavior on November 29, 1988. He called law enforcement repeatedly and early. He did not immediately mention that he and Deborah were separated and living apart. He did not provide the information that could have guided the search toward her Salem apartment. He did not call Deborah. He never called Deborah. He never called her apartment. And he offered explanations that felt crafted, not natural. The prosecution also leaned into Deborah's fear. Witnesses described troubled moments and violent encounters. Deborah had confided to people close to her that Bob had choked her before she moved out. She had expressed ongoing fear, especially during custody handoffs, the exact kind of meeting she was expected to have the night she disappeared. She had spoken the sentence that later became the center of the case. If anything happens to me, Bob did it. That statement carried the weight of prediction, not drama. It aligned with the outcome. Deborah disappeared on the night she was supposed to meet Bob. She was strangled. She was placed in the trunk. The mud on the tire aligned with Bob's lawn. The long-distance calls existed, yet did not appear on the home phone bill. The defense fought back with a different story of Deborah. They suggested she had a history of telling questionable stories, sometimes about her health, sometimes for attention. They suggested some accounts of her life could not be trusted. They also offered a different explanation for Bob not calling Deborah's apartment. Bob had spoken to Ed Holland, who told him Deborah was not at her apartment. The defense argued that made the call unnecessary. They defended the missing calls, suggesting faulty billing equipment that failed often, meaning calls could be placed without leaving proper records. They attacked the soil, arguing that Willamette Valley soil was common and could be found across the region, making it meaningless as a unique link to Bob's yard. They attacked the coat DNA, arguing it was transferred DNA, a tiny trace consistent with innocent contact in a shared custody situation. And they returned again and again to John Pearson. The semen found at autopsy, the contradiction in his later denial, his knowledge of Deborah's appointment, his detailed knowledge of her car, his disappearance from contact, his suicide when authorities located him. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. Rhianna waited with dread. She believed there had been no proof. She believed the case against her father was built out of suspicion and interpretation, not certainty. On April 17th, 2025, after about 6 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Robert Elmer Atrops was found guilty of murdering Deborah Lee Atrops 37 years after her death. The moment landed like a physical blow. Rhianna and those behind Bob collapsed into grief. To them, the verdict did not end a tragedy. It multiplied it. They were grieving someone who was still alive. Rhianna had not been able to hug her father in over 2 years. The case that began when she was a baby ended when she was an adult with children of her own. In July 2025, sentencing followed. Rhianna made an emotional appeal for leniency. A letter from Bob's current wife, married to him since 2011, was read in court. The courtroom held 2 versions of the same man. One side saw a killer who had hidden behind normal life. The other saw a father and grandfather being taken away. Bob was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If he lived long enough to be released, he would be an old man, far past the years when freedom would feel like a restored life. For Deborah's friends, the verdict answered the question that haunted them since 1988. They believed the truth had finally been named. For Rhianna, nothing felt settled. She had lived her life without her mother. Now she was forced to live it without her father. In the background of everything, Deborah remained the center. A woman described as bright, loving, and drawn again and again into relationships that brought trouble into her life. A mother who bonded deeply with her baby. A friend remembered decades later with the same ache of loss. On November 29, 1988, Deborah drove alone down rural Oregon roads. That drive was the last one she took alive. By December 1, her car was abandoned near a construction site in Beaverton, and the plates were gone, the window open, the keys inside, and Deborah was in the trunk, strangled, dressed, coated in mud, placed with care, and left for someone else to find. The mystery lasted more than 3 decades. When the case finally moved again, it did not rely on one perfect piece of evidence. It relied on many pieces, pulled from a coat collar, from mud on a tire, from missing phone records, from the absence of a call that should have been made, and from the pattern of fear Deborah carried before she died. In the end, the jury accepted the picture those pieces formed. Deborah Atrops was killed by Bob Atrops. Rhianna Stevens was left to carry the weight of both losses. The mother she never got to know, and the father she believed she did know, now locked behind prison walls, while the name Deborah Lee Atrops finally stopped being an unsolved case and became a resolved outcome.